Hello everyone, welcome to the Age Group Triathlon podcast. My name is Simon, I'm a professional triathlon coach, and in this week's episode I wanted to discuss FTP. So for those who are new, what is it? How we measure it, what to do with it, and how we can improve it. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to say a thank you because I've seen a nice uptick in the last few weeks of people sending me messages on Instagram, email, all of that, getting in touch, telling me what they enjoy about the podcast and how it's really helped them in their training. And I really want to say thank you because it's nice to know that I'm not just some incel sat in their bedroom making a podcast that nobody listens to and that isn't actually helping anyone. So yeah, a big thank you for those who actually get in touch and reference it. I really do appreciate that. Now on to the subject matter at hand. I'm going to be looking at functional threshold power, which I will now refer to as FTP. And we're going to start right at the basics, but we're going to get definitely a lot more advanced as we get through the episode. So don't worry if it seems a little bit basic to start out with, we are going to get onto some advanced stuff. Now, to start with, I wanted to just go over what cycling power is, because there may be, a number of you listening for whom they go, well, what's cycling power? They just get on their bike and they ride it around. Well, cycling power is an objective measurement of how hard it is that we are sort of training or racing, how hard we are pedaling our bike, I guess is the easiest way to say that. Now, ways in which we can sort of measure how hard it is that we're working in triathlon on the bike is relatively limited because speed is absolutely useless. Are you going up a hill? Are you going down a hill? Is there a headwind? Is there a tailwind? Even down to sort of the equipment that you have on your bike, the geometry, the fit of it, this all influences how fast you ride. And while speed is the ultimate goal for triathlon, not power, speed, being able to ride faster is the goal. Speed in itself is not a good indicator of intensity. If I'm setting somebody a workout, I can't say to them, aim to ride at 32 kilometers per hour. Because if they go up a mountain as opposed to going down a sweeping valley, there is just so much out there that can influence this. So speed, we can say, look, that's probably not going to be a very useful metric. However, we can look at heart rate. So a measure of how hard it is that our heart is working. And this is a very good idea of, how hard the body's working. In fact, it's the only metric we can measure that shows us how hard the body is actually working. Well, that's at least commonly used. Because measuring power is all well and good, but it doesn't tell us how hard it is on the body. And I always ask athletes to record heart rate, even if they're also recording with power. Because it gives me an idea of how hard it is, how much of a toll the workout is taking on the body. Power numbers on their own only tell half the story. The power numbers could look really solid, really consistent, but if the heart rate exponentially increases throughout that workout, if they're holding 210 watts for 2 hours, but they start off at 125 beats per minute and finish on 165 beats per minute, that's really important for me to know. So heart rate is great, but the issue with riding two heart rate targets is that, heart rate monitors, they're a little bit temperamental. You can be riding along or running along with your heart rate monitor and suddenly it will jump up by sort of 20, 30 beats per minute as the connection finally clicks and the electrodes get moistened enough. Or if you're using a heart rate monitor on your wrist, if you're sweaty or you're running, then the numbers on that are going to be very inaccurate. So I do refer to it as being the dial-up internet of metrics. It's useful, but it's far from perfect. Adding into that, of course, the fact that when you work hard, it can take around 10, 15, 20 seconds for the heart rate to actually peak to match the effort that you just did. So if you sprint over a short hill, you may actually find your heart rate continues to increase on the downhill as the effort that you put in on the hill is only just starting to register, which can make it incredibly frustrating metric to work with when you're looking at short-term intervals. Now, the beauty of cycling power is it is an instantaneous objective measure of effort. So if we are sprinting, as soon as we get up to a sprint, within those sort of 2-3 seconds it takes us to wind it up, we're going to see a huge increase in power. It takes into account the sort of the terrain that you're on. It takes into account all of the conditions. It's not influenced by anything like stress and sleep, which heart rate will be affected by. Now, sometimes it's not a terrible thing that exterior stresses outside of your training are reflected in your heart rate. However, it can get a little bit frustrating, especially if you know that it's not really impacting on your performance, or your heart rate lies outside of the normal zones. So it is a fantastic way for us to be able to get instant data and for us to be able to train accurately within a wide range of training. Now, if I take the average athlete and we say, okay, let's do some riding in your tempo zone, that may only be a bracket of around about sort of 7 or 8 beats per minute in some case. Try and ride between 100 and 168 beats per minute. It's going to be quite hard to keep your heart rate consistently there. Because if we're looking at power, we could be looking at a sort of 30 watt range that we need to try and hold, which is generally a bit easier. Now, the downside to power, as I sort of referred to previously, is that it doesn't tell us much about how it is that you're feeling on that day, which is why having heart rate and power data together are ideal. Now, as soon as most people's first experience of power is when they hop on a turbo trainer. The difference between a high power number and a low power number takes into account two things. That is your torque and your cadence. Now, torque is the amount of force that you're applying in a circular plane. So, when we are pushing our pedals round, the power meters will measure just how much force we are putting through that pedal. So, if we are riding up a hill, and our cadence is very slow, but the torque is very high because we're trying to push over this hill, we're going to get a high number. Equally, if we are riding on the flat and we are pedaling fast, but not with a huge amount of effort, that will also give us a reasonably high number because we are at a high cadence. If you look at the old boy who lives near you that cycles to the shops every morning on his old shopping bike, who's going to be pedaling very slowly and not putting a lot of torque through the pedals, he will get a very low power number. Whereas a Tour de France cyclist sprinting for the finish line, pedaling as fast as they can and putting huge forces through the drivetrain, they are going to have a very high power number. Now, all this data is perfectly interesting. Oh look, I've got this really big number. Oh, I managed to hit 800 watts when I did a sprint. Cool, good for you. But power number in itself isn't especially useful or insightful or actionable without having a benchmark of what it is that we can achieve. There's a lot of data out there in the cycling, the triathlon space, which is what a lot of people refer to as gee whiz data, where you look and you go, oh, gee whiz, I managed to average, 200 watts over that hill there. But without actually being able to know what your capabilities are or how you stack up against other cyclists or triathletes and that, this data isn't especially useful. It is just a point of interest. Now, to be able to interpret this data, we first need to know what our FTP is. Now, before I go into the testing methods, I first want to clear up what FTP is, because there is a bit of a misunderstanding here. Now, if you ask your average cyclist what FTP is, chances are they'll tell you it's the highest power that you can hold for 60 minutes. And this just isn't the case, and neither is it 95% of the power you can hold for 20 minutes. Okay, the sort of modern, as it were, definition of FTP is the highest power that you can hold in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. And this suddenly puts the cats among the pigeons a little bit, because you go, oh, hang on a minute, that sounds like really sciencey and very sort of, it's not quite as concrete. So what does it mean? Well, quasi-steady, we're talking about a power that is broadly steady, so that doesn't have a huge amount of increases and decreases in that power. We're looking for power that we can hold in a pretty steady state effort for a prolonged time. Again, it doesn't have to be absolutely flat, but if you were to sort of record somebody's best 20-minute power over a criterium race where there's going to be lots of coasting and surging and sprinting, that's probably not going to be representative. And it's the power that we can hold without fatiguing. Now, obviously, every effort is fatiguing, but anyone who has ever ridden hard for so anywhere between 20 minutes and an hour will know that you will, generally speaking, you'll find a point where you go, okay, this is really hard, but I'm going to see if I can squeeze a bit more out the legs. And they try just a little bit harder, and their body goes, no. Like, you can feel the lactic acid building up. You can feel your breathing starting to get ragged. And you know, that's just not sustainable. You can't hold that for much more than another minute or 30 seconds, because you're then starting to lean heavily on your anaerobic system. So what we're really trying to find out with our FTP is how much power we can generate in a purely aerobic state. For somewhere that's, generally speaking, between 30 minutes and an hour and 10 minutes. I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail later. But what I want you to understand is that it's not simply your best power you can hold for 60 minutes or an estimation of that. A number of cyclists will say, oh, I'm going to do a full hour to get the most accurate FTP possible. But I mean, that's a bad enough idea for cyclists, if I'm honest. For triathletes, there is a lot more that we should be doing with our time than doing 60 minutes and all-out effort. The fatigue that will create, the chance of you getting the pacing wrong and blowing up, it just doesn't make sense, especially when FTP isn't simply your highest 60-minute power. So I'm going to say, before we get stuck into the testing methodologies, please don't do 60 minutes hard, okay, as an FTP test. It's not worth it. So looking at some more useful test protocols, the first one I'm going to touch on is the classic, and this is the 20-minute test. So this is a case of riding 20 minutes as hard as you can. So this will normally involve a thorough warm-up, which I recommend that you follow. You don't just go into this 20 minutes cold. Okay, and you'll do, it's quite a tough warm up. It will push you in itself, the warm up, but it will get you warmed up and in prime position to push really hard when you get into the 20 minutes. Now, the downside with the 20-minute test is that it takes an awful lot of experience and knowledge of your body and pacing to get it right. And most people, it's not until they really do their third or their fourth 20-minute tests they can really nail it and go, okay, I know exactly what I need to do to be able to get a result that is reflective of my fitness. Because the idea of an FTP test is to give us an idea of your current fitness. I mean, realistically, it's more of a snapshot on your fitness on a given day than it is indication of how well the last training block has gone. But still, you know what, we can't test ourselves every day, obviously, so we use FTP tests. But if we are looking to do a 20-minute test and we go out too hard and we blow up 15 minutes in, or we go too easy and do a big surge in the last 2 minutes when we realise that, oh gosh, I could have pushed a lot more power than this, that is going to cause us an awful lot of issues. So for those who are just starting out, who don't really know their body, who are new cyclists, I recommend against a 20-minute test. However, if you are an experienced triathlete, if you know your body, you've done a few races, and you know how to get the most out of yourself, how to get every drop out of your legs, the 20-minute test is the way to go because it's so much more accurate than other methods. The next test I look at is the ramp test. Now, this is a very simple test and it is my preferred method for many triathletes, especially those who are newer to cycling. And what you do is you start out and you ride easy for a few minutes as warm-up, and then it gets a little bit harder for a minute. And then for another minute it gets harder. And then the next minute it gets harder, and the next minute it gets harder. And you go up and up and up, and you ramp up, ramp up, ramp up, until you get to the point where your legs just can't push the pedals around anymore. Now, the idea with this is that it's a true test to exhaustion, so you don't have to worry about pacing. What you will learn, if you do a few of these, is that the first time you do it, you're probably going to give up too soon. because you're not used to putting your body in the kind of place where you're going to be able to find out exactly what it is that it's capable of. The more that you train, the more you learn about yourself, the more you realise just how deep it is that you can go. However, when we're starting out, I do think the ramp test is the better option because you don't have to worry about pacing. A version I don't see so much these days, but was definitely been popular in the past, is the 8-minute test, where you do 2 really maximal 8-minute efforts with a rest in between. Now, this creates a lot less fatigue than a 20-minute test, but it's also less accurate. However, it is more accurate than the ramp test. So it's a bit of an intermediate. To be honest, I've never set an athlete the 8-minute test. I generally think if they're a newer athlete, we'll do the ramp test. If they're a more experienced athlete and they want accuracy, we'll do the 20-minute test. The 8-minute test, it sits in that awkward sort of no man's land for me. Now, how it is that we calculate your FTP depends on the test. Now, if we're doing the 20-minute test, we're going to take 95% of your average power over the 20 minutes, and that will give us our FTP number. For the ramp test, we are going to look at the highest 1 minute power, so it really does matter every single pedal stroke that you can grind out on the ramp test. To calculate your actual FTP, we take the highest average power over 1 minute, and we take 75% of that number. And with the 8-minute test, we take the average power from those 2 8-minute blocks and we reduce sort of 10% from that to give us our FTP. So why is it that we're skimming a bit off of the top with all of these tests? Well, the reason is that FTP is a measure of aerobic fitness. And we want to remove any contribution by the anaerobic system. So if we are trying to pace, say, an Ironman or an Ironman 70.3, then we want to know that the effort that we are going to be outputting is going to be sustainable for 90 kilometers. And over those 90 kilometers, we don't want to be using any anaerobic sort of systems ideally, because that is going to fatigue us, that's going to be burning matches. We want to make our calculations based on simply using our aerobic system. And if we are looking at our FTP tests and we are taking, say, 100% of our 20-minute power, that is going to give us targets that are simply too high, that we are not going to be able to achieve in our training. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. But the main takeaway is that we take this average of 5% off of our 20-minute test and also sort of 10% off our 8-minute test, so that we are simply getting an idea of what is sustainable over a long period without the anaerobic system. Now, if you don't subtract this percentage from your FTP test, or if you sort of, like myself, are somebody who tests really well in that, really good at digging ourselves a very deep hole in a test, you can end up with something known as a vanity FTP. So this is an FTP that you may have set, it could have been calculated wrong, or you could have just been on an absolute blinder of a day. And you set an FTP test which is not representative of your fitness. And the issue with this is that all of your workouts are calculated based on the results of your FTP test. So if you set an FTP which is a sort of a 5-10% overestimation of what you're generally capable of for whatever reason, then all of your workouts are going to be 5-10% harder than they should be. What's the result of this? Well, the result is overtraining and burnout, because your easy days are no longer easy, and your hard workouts you're constantly failing because they're just that bit too high for them. But these athletes, they are so unwilling to let go of this FTP number because of the pride it brings them to be able to tell people, my FTP is 280 watts. They don't want to accept that actually it's probably closer to 260 or 265. And as a result, they train too hard and they burn out. And the result is they perform worse than they would have if they just accepted that, you know what, I think my FTP is a bit high. It's happened to me. I had to manually reduce my FTP a bit based on the result that I got. Because I could tell, looking at the heart rate data and how I felt during what should have been zone 2 training, that this wasn't really sustainable, and that if I wanted to actually get some good training in with some good intervals instead of dragging myself through sort of what should have been easy workouts that were really quite tough for me, then I needed to lower my FTP. Now the reason that FTP is so critical is, as I referred to, all of our workouts after the test are based off of this number. And if you did not push hard enough in the test, if you gave up too soon, if the demons in your head just got the better of you and told you that you weren't good enough, that you couldn't do this, then your workouts are going to be too easy. If you go into a test and you go, you know what, I think I can get an FTP of 210 watts. So they go into the test and they push really hard and they come away with, guess what? 210 watts. The FTP test, there is an art to them, but they really should be an absolute maximum. Lay it all on the table, see what you're capable of. Because if you don't go deep enough with your FTP, if you don't push hard enough in your test, you are going to end up in a lot of trouble. Because all of your workouts will end up being too easy and you're not going to achieve your potential. So all of the advice that I give people, that I coach, and generally through the podcast and the like, all of the advice is on the assumption you have an accurate FTP number. Now some people might do a test and think, right, okay, I'm going to test to see if this is my FTP by trying to hold it for an hour. Look, just don't do that. You know, that's not a good use of time. However, we do need to be realistic. We do need to check in with ourselves and our coaches to constantly try to check that ensure that the FTP number is accurate. Because if the workouts are getting to be a bit easy, we might need to retest. Now, a newer athlete, they may want to retest their FTP every 6 to 8 weeks with some good regularity because they are going to be improving quite fast. For more seasoned athletes, we might only do 1 or 2 a year. But the way that I personally check with my athletes, see if they're ready for a test, is I look at their heart rate. Touched on a heart rate at the start. If somebody does a ride in power zone 2, but their heart rate spends significant time in heart rate zone 1, assuming that their heart rate zones are accurate, which generally speaking, heart rate zones are more likely to be accurate because they don't change an enormous amount over the years. If we are around zone 1, that is a sign that the FTP is probably too low and we should do another test. Equally, if the athlete comes back to me, if they manage to crush all of their VO2 intervals without a problem, if they say that their sweet spot or FTP intervals were like tough but manageable, this tells me that we need to retest that FTP. Now, there is another way to calculate your FTP. And this is something that I generally say for clients that are on my bespoke programs who are high performance. Now, I used to do this with all athletes when I first downloaded this software, but I then realised that for a lot of athletes it was probably overkill and it was better to just do the ramp test, especially when you consider how quickly new athletes improve. And this method is known as power modelling. So the way it works is it draws up a graph I should say, and it looks at, okay, so what is their best power that they've achieved over 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and they take every single second and they over the last sort of 90-day period. 90 days is the standard period we look at. So we get a map of somebody's power. Now, somebody's power is always going to be highest over short intervals. And then once we get to the kind of the 3-minute mark, it starts to drop. By the time we get to 10 minutes, it plateaus out a bit. And once it plateaus, it will then plateau until around about somewhere between 20 to 60 minutes, and then it'll drop off sharply. Now, by importing all the data from all of your rides over the last 90 days, this in itself can give us a much more accurate idea of your FTP than simply taking the result from one test. So how does this work? Well, we look at the 15-second power, and that is the sort of somebody's sprint. We do a 15-second test, so we're looking at somebody's maximal anaerobic output. So how hard it is that somebody can sprint. Because this shows us generally how anaerobically fit somebody is, and as a result, how much their anaerobic fitness contributes to their result. We also look at somebody's 1 minute power, so do a 1 minute test, which will give us an idea kind of how much their power falls off between that 15-second and that 1 minute mark, again, to give us an idea of sort of a more intensive anaerobic effort. So your 15-second power may be sort of perfect if you're looking to win a bunch race in a sprint, and you might, swing around your lead out man and do a really hard 15-second effort if you're a cyclist. Whereas if you are looking for an uphill finish where you just bury yourself, then that 1 minute test could become more useful. We are triathletes, so we're interested in doing neither. However, again, it still gives us an idea of how your body sort of is working and processing energy overall. After the 1 minute test, we'll then do a 5 minute test, which looks at our VO2 max. So this is, broadly speaking, looking at how sort of the kind of power that we can maintain whilst almost exclusively not exclusively, very heavily leaning on the aerobic system. So a lot of VO2 intervals are sort of around about the 3, maybe 4 minute mark. So 5 minutes is a little longer than that. But this really gives us a fantastic insight into somebody's VO2 max, which is quite important for this algorithm to be able to dictate what it is that your power is. And then finally, we look at somebody's sort of longer power. Now this is... So it will be a 20-minute test, broadly speaking, for most people. So you still have to do that 20-minute test, unfortunately, in most cases. But it will give us a really good idea by looking at our 15-second power, 1 minute power, 5 minute power, and 20-minute power. We are looking at lots of different energy systems there. And then the software can put it all together. So it's not just looking at the test, it's also looking at, when you've been out riding, when you've done races, it looks at all the data that you have collated, and it goes, okay, let's put this together. And it is a big maths engine that does it, but it comes out with what's called your modelled FTP. So this uses the power modelling to go, right, we think your FTP is this. And it is hands down the most accurate way to be able to track your FTP. Because it's not simply looking at a single number, 95% of your best 20-minute power. Now, we still include that number, but because we are looking at the contribution from the anaerobic system, we can get a more accurate FTP number. Now, if you take somebody like myself, who does not have an especially good anaerobic system, I don't train my anaerobic system. When I am doing my 20-minute test, 5% of my power is not coming from the anaerobic system, because the software that I use, called WKO, is also Golden Cheetah out there and a couple of others. That data is going, look, Simon's really anaerobically pretty weak, so his contribution from the aerobic system will be lower. So chances are his FTP is probably going to be close to about 97.5%, 98% of his 20-minute effort. And if I was going off of the 20-minute effort alone, that would give me a very sort of low-balled FTP. I say very, it's not going to be very, but it could be an FTP that could be sort of 5-10 watts too low, which may not sound like an enormous amount, but it can definitely be significant, especially for somebody who has a higher FTP, where each percentage point change is going to be more significant, and an athlete who is more advanced, who's been training for a long time, where an FTP increase of sort of 2, 3, 4 watts, it could feel quite meaningful and quite impactful. So it is the best way for us to be able to calculate our FTP. But if we are using WKO, FTP is not the only thing that we can calculate. It will also analyse somebody's VO2 max, because we have all of this data that we, from all of our riding that we can collate, and it can find that sort of where it really starts to drop off, and they can make a pretty good estimate of what somebody's VO2 max is. Now, of course, if you're not in the lab with a mask on, then we cannot say for certain this is your VO2 max. But it is, by and large, the most accurate way for us to be able to measure your aerobic capacity, because it has a wide variety of data to look at. In fact, given the fact that it's looking at all of your riding over the last 90 days, it could in some ways, obviously you don't have the same accuracy from having the mask on, but because it looks at your training in general rather than a snapshot of a single day, it could actually, it could give a really sort of relatively accurate look at your VO2 max. Definitely not more accurate than a lab test on one day, but I'd say that, there's definite mileage in this figure here. We can also learn our time to exhaustion, TTE, and this is the indication of how long we can hold our FTP for. Which again, it shows that it's not simply a case of our best power that we can hold for 60 minutes. Now, for a lot of people, their time to exhaustion is going to be around about the 30-minute mark. Here's your FTP, and we think you can hold it for about 30 minutes. But for those who are more advanced, those who have more data as well that's been pulled into WKO, especially those who race sort of sprint and Olympic distance, where they're going to be going harder for much longer periods, they will be able to get a more accurate time to endurance, or even Zwift races, time trials I should say, because it will look at the data and go, okay, so we can tell that your FTP is around about, say, 170 watts, but you can actually hold it for a really long time. In fact, up to like an hour and 10 minutes in some cases. I've definitely seen myself having a time to endurance of sort of an hour and 9 minutes. And between the FTP and the time to endurance, it's time to exhaustion, that can give us a real insight into where it is that we need to improve as athletes. Because if somebody has an FTP with a very low time to endurance, then that tells us, okay, well, let's focus on trying to hold that FTP for longer. Conversely, if somebody has a very long time to exhaustion, then we'll go, okay, well, maybe we need to actually start focusing on increasing this FTP, getting this number higher. And that could be done with sort of shorter intervals, VO2 max, that kind of stuff. WKO can also teach us our Pmax, that is the maximum power that we can output with a single pedal stroke. And you can also look at our anaerobic battery, so it shows us just how much we can sustain with sort of in the anaerobic state before we run out of juice, before we run out of energy. And for triathletes, this is generally pretty low. WKO will also give us a phenotype, so it will say to us, okay, are you a sprinter? Are you an all-rounder? Are you a time trialist, or are you a pursuiter? And I have a lot of people who come to me that will be more in the line of sort of pursuiter, all-rounder, but over time, as you do more in the way of training, then we generally want to see people shift towards that time trialer type. WKO will also teach me what somebody's FTP is as a percentage of their VO2 max, which can tell me is somebody's limiter. Sort of their FTP, can they go higher with their FTP with more muscular endurance, or is the limiting factor their VO2 max? Which again, this all influences the decisions that I make on the intervals that I give people, and it also would tell me what somebody's target intervals should be, both the duration and the intensity, which for me, mostly as a triathlon coach, it would inform me what length somebody's VO2 interval should be and what the power target should be. Now, I could, talk the hind legs off of a donkey about what it is that WKO can do. I'm not going to. I can create my own charts in there, create reports. I can go really into the weeds with somebody's cycling performance. But I'm going to save my breath because you're here to hear broadly about FTP, but I wanted to draw this to your attention for those of you who want that next level of data. Now, WKO isn't cheap to get a license, so if you wanted to get an insight into all of this data, historically, I can go through all of your data and tell you all of this. Head to the show notes, drop me an email, and I can do you a consultation where I'll go through or import all of your data from Training Peaks into WKO, or if you don't have an account, I can help you work out how to import data into Training Peaks. Import it into WKO and I can give you a full breakdown of your FTP for £40 or your regional equivalent. Drop me an email if you're interested in that. But let's get back onto sort of the subject of FTP. And well, once we have this number, we can set workouts to it as a percentage of our FTP. But what else can we do with it? Now, if any of you listened to last week's marathon episode, you'd have heard me talk about best bike split and talk about how we can use the FTP to be able to find, race targets, as it were, targets for race day, what kind of power we're going to hold, and also create estimations of how fast it is that we're going to go. And having an accurate FTP is a big part of this. Now, a lot of people will get quite sort of protective over their FTP, and during the first sort of few years that you're training, you should see it increase sort of quite exponentially. But the hard truth of the matter is that once you're training for some time, then you are going to see dips in your FTP, because the closer you come to your potential, the harder it is to maintain that. And when you're at this time of year, in November, then you may not be at peak FTP. So you do need to sort of to acknowledge, look, it's going to be a snapshot of where I'm at the moment, but in a season, it may take us a few months to get up to the FTP that you were at last season, but hopefully we will overtake that, and by the time we get to your most important races, we will have exceeded what it is that you were able to achieve last year. But FTP, it really is a good tool for planning our training, for being able to see what it is that we're capable of, and also sort of planning our racing. It's not perfect, and it does have a lot of limitations. So next up, I'm going to go over, some ideas of where FTP probably isn't so useful. Now, I imagine most of you will be familiar with a bell curve. If you're not, stick it into Google so you can visualize what I'm going to talk you through. Now, the importance of FTP is something with an inverse bell curve, where it is really important to somebody just starting out. And it's really important to those who are right at the top end of the sport. But to those in the middle, it's not really that useful. So let me explain. So if you imagine somebody is just starting out in triathlon and they're going a more traditional route. So they've just discovered cycling, they've got themselves a turbo train, they're doing short races, and their FTP is actually a really useful insight into how they're progressing as a cyclist, but it's also quite relevant to their racing, because in their races they are going really hard for that kind of 30-40 minutes up to sort of an hour and 20 in some cases. And that FTP is going to give a real bearing on what they're capable of. If they're doing an Olympic triathlon, a 40-kilometre bike, and they have a nice high FTP, then their time to endurance and the size of that FTP is going to be quite relevant, really, to what it is that they're able to achieve. However, once we start getting longer, once we start looking at especially stepping up to the 70.3 distance, FTP becomes less important, because we're much less worried about being incrementally faster on the bike by, I got a 5 watts FTP increase, and we're more worried about, are we going to end up walking on the run or not? Because nobody cares what your FTP is when you're walking the Ironman marathon. It doesn't matter how hard you've pushed yourself, how hard you trained, all the hours you put in on the bike. If you went too hard on the bike, if your nutrition's wrong, if you ended up with an injury, if your running is sort of quite weak, okay, all of this goes out the window. Bike for show, run for dough is a saying amongst a lot of triathletes, and this does hold some water. That's because over short distances, sort of pushing deeper, pushing harder is really important to somebody's success, and they will see great advances in their racing times as they improve their FTP, and they generally get fitter. Harder intervals are going to see results, whereas when you're looking at longer distance efforts, there are just a lot of things that are more important than increasing your FTP by a few watts here and there. If you are starting out, if you are looking to step up to 70.3, or you're starting straight with 70.3 or the Ironman distance, I don't want you to obsess over your FTP because it's a vanity metric at this point. What we are interested in is, do we have the fitness to be able to go and to ride 90 kilometers or 180 kilometers and still be able to run well off the back of that? Because I'll tell you one thing, when I did my first 70.3, a number of you have heard me tell this story before, I did my first 70.3, my half marathon PB was 134. And my FTP would have been somewhere around like 220 watts at the time, I believe. Which for somebody like myself, I was pretty happy with. But my half marathon time at that first 70.3 was 2 hours and 56 minutes. I got everything wrong. Got my nutrition wrong. Got my pacing wrong. I wasn't fit enough. How hard I could push over 20 minutes had no bearing on that day. No bearing. And I focused on these things far too much, to my detriment. I ended up putting in a really embarrassing performance because I was more focused on my 5k time, which I think at the time I could comfortably go under 20 minutes over a 5k. Then why am I running nearly 3 hours for a half marathon? Because there are so many important things that are more important to the middle and long course athlete than FTP. Now, I still think we should do FTP tests, because we need to have targets for us to train to. But the focus should not be on improving the FTP. The focus should be on extending the time that we can spend on the bike with minimal fatigue. And this is where the long, easy training comes in. And this is where some people get themselves in a spin, because they want to see an improved FTP, because they see FTP as being an objective measure of how good a cyclist they are, and they get caught up in this. And they come to a coach like me and they go, Simon, I need to get faster. I want to go longer. I want to do this. And go, okay, well, we're going to need to do all of these like easier sessions and longer sessions. No. I want to get faster. I want to do the best. No, you don't understand. You go faster by holding a low effort for a prolonged period of time without slowing. Without slowing being the operative words there. This is something that so many people, especially sort of young men, myself being one of them at the time, getting caught up in that, whether I'm still young, I don't know, that's still up for debate. They get really caught up in this, and it's hard to get the message through to them that FTP, it's not the be all and end all. It should not become your identity. It should not be the objective of your training to get a high FTP. The objective of your training should be to race faster. Now, FTP can be a useful tool in this. It's a good measure of bike fitness, but it counts for nothing if all things go against the wall on race day. If you do a 6-hour Ironman marathon because you push too hard on the bike, are you going to be telling people to go past them, oh yeah, I've got an FTP of 300 watts? No, nobody cares because you're walking. So at this stage, when you're in that kind of getting used to these middle and long distance races, FTP shouldn't be the focus. But if we want to improve our racing over the middle and the long distance, that, my friends, is when we need to start worrying about FTP again. Because being able to hold a higher wattage by increasing your FTP is a good way for us to improve our cycling. Now, it feels like I'm repeating what I said last week, but I will do, because there are going to be lots of people listening who didn't listen last week. But over an Ironman, we're probably only going to be holding somewhere around 70% of our FTP. Now, if 70% of our FTP is 220 watts, or 70% of FTP is 250 watts, that's very different. That's a 30% difference in FTP, which gives us a 30% difference in our target. So by increasing our FTP, we will be increasing the power that we can hold at that intensity factor there. So that is really important. And I do not want to take away from it. I do not want somebody to come away from this going, oh, FTP is pointless for Ironman, you don't need to worry about it. No, it's not at all. But for new athletes, they need to focus on being able to complete the race, being able to string all three disciplines together rather than just seeing FTP as being a vanity metric. Whereas those who are at the pointy end of affairs, those who want to qualify for Kona, who want to set PBs, who want to go under 10 hours, these are the people for whom improving FTP really does matter. Because if they have completed a number of races to a decent standard, that's when our lens can flip from, okay, how do we get our heads around this distance? How do we make sure we get the medal? To, let's go out there and let's absolutely smash it and do the best that we can. So the more performance orientated you are, the more important FTP is. If you're coming from this mindset of, I just want to get round, then yeah, FTP is worth doing one a test at least. Maybe one if, others if you start to improve faster, but it should not be the real litmus test for your improvements in fitness and how you think you're going to perform on the day. There's a lot more to performance than FTP. So let's wrap this up. Let's conclude things a little bit here. So we've learned that FTP, it's not simply a case of 60 minutes, what you can hold for 60 minutes. It's not just 95% of a 20-minute test. It is the highest power you can hold in this sort of steady state, really, for up to around about 70 minutes, depending on how fit you are. It is a performance metric that gives us an objective idea of our performance, but it doesn't tell us the whole story. We need to combine it with heart rate data for us to be able to really sort of understand where it is that somebody is, especially sort of myself as a coach, looking at this data in an objective way. And we also can understand that, FTP is used to set ourselves workouts. A percentage of FTP is a great way for us to be able to set workouts in an accurate way. There are more accurate ways that we can calculate our FTP using power modelling, but we do need high quality data to do so. And the testing required to be able to get this number, it can be quite extensive doing all of these tests. So we do need to be mindful whether it's really right for us. Generally speaking, for advanced athletes, that is where they're going to see the most benefit. But again, it can benefit anyone who wants to see their data in more detail. Just be aware that that will improve and change sort of quite rapidly over time. And the FTP, yes, it is definitely a performance metric. We can use it to predict race performances. But if we are looking to get started in 70.3 or Ironman, the size of our FTP does not really matter. It will not really have much of an impact on the race if we're injured because we didn't do strength work, if we get the pacing of different sections wrong, if running just isn't good enough, if we go too hard on the bike, if we find ourselves stuck in the portaloos because our nutrition went really badly. There is so much more to our performance on the race day than the size of our FTP, so don't get overly hung up on it. When you start to get a couple of really good races under your belt and you want to improve, that's when we can revisit FTP. But until then, please don't get to the point where you're trying to obsess too much about this number and seeing it as being the be-all and end-all of performance. So let's look at how we improve our FTP. How is it that we can get a higher FTP number? Now, here's a little something for you. And that is that every second that you spend on your bike pushing those pedals around is going to improve your FTP. Just as the more time that you spend in the water is going to improve your swimming, the more time you spend running is going to help you become a better runner, or that's that time on feet. As long as you're riding your bike, you're going to be improving your FTP. Now, that's not to say that all methods of training are built equally. If somebody's objective is to build their FTP, then we need to understand a few things. First of all, we need to go, well, what's the limiter? What is it that's stopping somebody from having a higher FTP? And this is something that I'll have conversations with athletes about to help understand. Is it that when you're riding, that you just can't get enough air in? That you're just really rattling, you're struggling for breath, and your whole body just feels empty? Or is it that your legs seize up, they get sore, the muscles cannot keep pushing those pedals around? Now, if it is the former, which for most people it is simply they feel they're hitting a glass ceiling where their body just won't let them go any faster, then we're probably going to be looking at two intensities that we're going to want to focus on to really give us the best chance of improving our FTP. And that is zone 2, and that is zone 5. Now, zone 2 are those long, easy, steady intervals which build our aerobic capacity. Okay, I talk about them all the time. All coaches do, because of how important they are. Because they stimulate the growth of mitochondria, they improve our heart's ability to pump more oxygen, with more blood with more oxygen in it around the body in a timely fashion. It is the key to becoming a faster endurance athlete, which is combined with some sessions which are going to be at VO2 max, which is really targeting the top end of our aerobic capacity just before it tips into becoming anaerobic. By focusing on these, that is how we really boost our aerobic fitness. If we feel that our FTP is being limited more by sort of our legs, which I definitely work with some people, and that's the case, they feel they're just lacking sort of the muscular endurance, that is when we might go, okay, well maybe we need to do more intervals at FTP. But things like riding FTP is very demanding, which is where sweet spot intervals have come from, which is where you're riding an intensity that's just below FTP. You know, sort of the high 80, low 90% of FTP, maybe mid-90s, depending on, what somebody's definition of FTP is. But these sweet spot intervals that we can do, they generate notably less fatigue than an FTP interval will for the majority of the benefit. And you can also spend longer in this zone. So I tend to set people more in the way of sweet spot intervals than I do FTP intervals. That's not to say that I don't set people some good FTP intervals. I mean, I think that one of the toughest workouts that I have is 4 by 10 minute FTP intervals with steadily reducing rest as you go over. I mean, a lot of people they sort of find what they're capable of during that set. I do set them. But for the majority of people, where their aerobic fitness is the limiter to their FTP, and more importantly, is going to be the limiter to their performance on a race day, then spending more time around zone 2 and zone 5 is probably going to be more impactful. And there is a bit of time for some zone 3, some tempo work, developing that muscular endurance. But it's going to do less to actually improve your FTP, as it will sort of your time to endurance and your ability to hold a higher percentage of FTP for a prolonged time. So how you improve your FTP is going to depend on what your limiters are at the moment. So I hope you found that all useful. I hope that next time you hear somebody bragging about the size of their FTP on the group ride and how it's all about doing that 60-minute test and, it's what you can hold for an hour and pushing really hard, then you sit there and you can quietly think to yourself, yeah, I think I know a bit more about cycling performance than you do. Now, before I go, I just wanted to flag up. In the last week, I have managed to sign up 4 clients, which I think is something of a record, which is quite nice for me. However, that does mean that I'm not going to be able to keep on taking clients at this rate indefinitely. So if you are listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, you know what, I'd love to work with Simon. He sounds like he's the kind of coach who might understand me, and I want him to help me achieve my triathlon goals in 2026. You probably can't afford to hang around an awful lot later. There's only so many clients that I can afford to work with at once before the quality of the work starts to suffer. So if you are interested in working with me, if you have been procrastinating, or you're thinking, oh, definitely start in the new year, start in the spring, I can't guarantee I'll have space then. So drop me an email if you're interested. Thank you so much for your company this week. I really hope that you have enjoyed it, you found it useful, and you're going to feel a bit more informed going forward and a bit less gung-ho. Drop me an email if you've got any questions about the subject matter. I'll do my best to help you. Until then, I will see you all next Tuesday morning, where I'll be back with more triathlon tips. Take care now. Enjoy.